Section 7 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 14. Commandant Damer Dawson, Mrs. Carden, and the Women Police and Patrols. The employment of women for police service, in vogue for some years on the continent and in the United States of America, has been developed in this country only by the outbreak of war. Women in uniform are so frequent nowadays that the passerby scarcely spares a glance for a hard bowler kind of hat, plain blue clothes, and a blue armlet with white letters on it. The wearers of this uniform seem to be peculiarly inobtrusive people, anxious to avoid rather than to attract attention. For all that, among the innumerable women who are taking on the new work which the times have entailed, the women police are by no means the least valuable, brave, and steadfast. The names of 3 pioneers are impressed on the memory of those who have watched the development of this movement in Great Britain: Commandant Damer Dawson, Superintendent M.S. Allen, and Inspector Goldingham. It is largely through their tireless efforts that the Women Police Service, the association that they originated, has now at its command one of the finest bodies of women in the country. The influx of the Belgian refugees in August 1914 became the starting point of the movement. While aiding forlorn exiles lost in London byways in the small hours of the night, it was borne in upon Miss Damer Dawson how much work in the street could be done by an organized band of trained women armed with authority. The idea took root in her mind and grew with her work. She was soon joined by Miss M.S. Allen and Miss Goldingham, and from that period the Women Police Service may be said to have originated. These pioneers obtained the necessary training and soon set to work in the organization of a voluntary corps. Recruits flocked in, undertook necessary training in drill, practical, and theoretical instruction, and soon obtained positions as officially appointed policewomen. In this capacity, they undertake such work as patrolling the streets, attendance at police courts, domiciliary visiting, the supervision of music halls, cinemas, and public dancing halls, and the inspection of common lodging houses. The need for their services grew steadily. In the summer of 1916, it was found necessary to obtain further control and supervision of the women employees in munition factories, and Sir Edward Henry, the Chief Commissioner of Police, recommended that the Ministry of Munitions should apply to the Women Police Service for a supply of trained women. This request has now created an extensive development, and a new department of the Women Police Service is at present working at high pressure under the Ministry of Munitions. Recruits are streaming in and are receiving a special training, on completion of which they are drafted to the munition factories. There they undertake multifarious duties, including checking the entry of women into the factory, examining passports, searching for such contraband as matches, cigarettes, and alcohol, dealing with the complaints of petty offenses, assisting the magistrate at the police court, and patrolling the neighborhood of the factory with the view to the protection of the women employees. In the case of misunderstandings amongst the women employees, the services of the women police have been remarkable, and there are many recorded instances where they have averted strikes in the munition factories, and thus saved the nation from ill effects on output. In many such ways, the women police have proved themselves a valuable national asset. When the war is over, Commandant Damer Dawson and her colleagues will doubtless find that the service they helped to introduce as an emergency measure has become a recognized institution of a new social order. A further service, that of women's patrols for the protection of girls in the streets, has originated with the problems connected with the war. Reports from various quarters having reached the National Union of Women Workers as to the dangers caused by the presence of numbers of young girls in the neighborhood of military camps, it was resolved to organize a body of women of mature age and experience to aid the police in maintaining order. Here again, the names of 3 outstanding women are associated with this work: Mrs. Carden, the honorary secretary to the movement; Mrs. Creighton, widow of the late Bishop of London; and Lady Codrington, chairman of the London Committee of Women's Patrols. To these pioneers, the work owes its initiation and development. A scheme was formulated, welcomed at once by the Home Secretary and the Chief Commissioner of Police, and by November 1914, the Women's Patrols were in working order. Branches were quickly established throughout the United Kingdom and Ireland, and there are now over 2,000 women working in this connection in different parts of the country. In its initial stages, the work was entirely voluntary, but since its efficiency has been established and noted by the authorities, women's patrols have been appointed in various districts and paid at the same rate as men constables. The main duty of the patrols is to enter into kindly relationship with girls loitering in vicinities where soldiers congregate. Their mission is not to the vicious or to the fallen, but to the thoughtless girls led astray mainly through their excitement at the unaccustomed presence of so many soldiers and by patriotic emotions of admiration and gratitude to the nation's young defenders. The women on patrol aimed at getting into touch with such girls and helping them to a healthy employment of their leisure hours. In numerous cases, the patrol committee have organized clubs in the neighborhood of the military quarters, these meeting places being either for girls alone or mixed clubs where the soldiers may bring their girlfriends. In the latter case, most careful vigilance and supervision from the patrols are required and given, and success is in most instances attained. This work has been warmly welcomed by the military authorities and the police, and it is impossible to estimate the unhappiness and suffering that have been prevented by this provision of healthy recreation in a moral danger zone. Reports both from the metropolitan area, where over 400 patrols are now working, and from provincial towns give some measure of the success of the movement. It is significant that during the Irish disturbances of 1916, the women's patrols were enabled to pursue their customary tasks, being passed through both by the Revolutionary Party and by the soldiers. 15. Miss Lena Ashwell, OBE. Miss Lena Ashwell's work in starting and arranging concerts at the front has possibly given more delight to a greater number of people than the efforts of any other individual woman in the war. The entire scheme was her own, and it is through her untiring efforts and her personal energy that the work has been carried on and extended in a way that is little short of marvelous. It was in February 1915 that Miss Ashwell was asked by the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee of the YMCA to send a concert party to France, and with the goodwill and cooperation of that committee, the work was launched on its successful course. The first party was an experiment in every way, but its reception left no doubt as to the feelings of the soldier audiences. The love of music is enhanced by the alternating monotony and danger of life at the front, and is as fundamental in human beings as the craving for beauty. This instinct is seen, for instance, in the soldiers' touching desire to make gardens wherever they are quartered, and however unpromising the conditions. From Miss Ashwell's tentative effort, there has grown up a great organization in response to the ever-increasing request from every base, from every camp, from every hospital, and even from the firing lines for more and more concerts. In little more than 2 years, over 5,000 concerts have been given in France alone, apart from what has been done in Malta, in Egypt, and in the ships of the Adriatic fleet. The audiences have been known to number as many as 5,000 men, and thus hundreds of thousands are reached every month and millions during the year. What are called permanent concert parties have been established at 5 of the bases in France. Each party stays for about 6 weeks, giving on an average 3 concerts a day. In the afternoons, they usually perform in the hospitals. In the evenings, they motor sometimes 25 or 30 miles to outlying camps and stations, performing in tents, huts, barns, sheds, railway sidings, or even by the roadside, to all sorts and conditions of men in all branches of the army. The request for the concert parties to go up to the trenches and firing lines soon followed, and this fresh branch of work was undertaken. Only men are allowed to go in the firing line parties, and the YMCA cars convey them on these tours. Concerts have frequently been given under shell fire, sometimes to an audience fully armed and liable to be ordered into the trenches at any moment. Some of the most successful concerts are those for men just leaving the trenches after days of fighting, and here, perhaps, the music has had its most wonderful effect. It seems to act like magic on the exhausted men, strained almost beyond endurance by the ordeals they have had to face. The spell of horror is broken, and their minds are turned away from all they have suffered to thoughts of beauty and happiness. The existence of the firing line concert parties is in itself a proof of how much the military authorities appreciate the concerts and their effects. They have been quick to realize that the British Army can stand anything better than being bored. The keenness with which the concerts are anticipated, the touching patience of the men who will wait for hours in bitter wind and rain, they would rather miss their principal meal than miss a performance. The discussion for weeks afterwards all prove how much the music means to them. At the outset, Miss Ashwell determined that the concerts should be up to a high standard. The programs are varied as much as possible. Classical music, selections from operas, glees, trios, and concertos, the old ballads and folk songs are all given, as well as popular ragtimes and modern chorus songs. A concert party generally consists of a soprano, contralto, bass, tenor, violinist or cellist, pianist and accompanist, and often a ventriloquist, conjurer, or reciter. The entertainment given is a mixture of a ballet concert, a recital, and a children's party, writes a member of one audience. Sometimes plays are arranged, and in the autumn of 1916, Miss Ashwell herself took out a small dramatic company and acted in Macbeth, The School for Scandal, and some short modern plays. Writing of these performances, Miss Ashwell says, "We gave The School for Scandal in a wood, with half our audience on the grass, the other half dangerously overcrowding the branches of the nearest trees. Macbeth was given in a great hangar, with army blankets for the walls of the banqueting hall and a sugar box for the throne. Macbeth was an enormous success. Its reception was wonderful. We gave it to vast audiences. They listened breathlessly in absolute silence, and then cheered and cheered and cheered. There were never such audiences in the world before, so keen, so appreciative, so grateful." Nothing can be more touching than the appreciation of the concerts in hospital. There again, the spell of the music seems to relax the strain on men's nerves, and the badly wounded and even dying soldiers beg to hear it and find comfort in the midst of their suffering. The following is an extract from a letter written by a nurse. The concert party gave a concert in the orderly room here, and afterwards those kind people came into each ward and sang softly with no accompaniment to the men who were well enough to listen. And the little Canadian storyteller told stories to each man in turn as he was having his dressings done. The result was that instead of being a suffering mass of humanity, the men were happy and amused through the whole of the time that is usually so awful. Concerts are also given for the medical service and nurses, for whom these occasional evenings are the only relaxation in a life of strict discipline and unending work. In January 1916, in response to urgent requests, arrangements were made to extend the work to Malta, and in October 1916 to Egypt. And as in France, the success has been wonderful. Lord Methuen, the governor of Malta, wrote to Miss Ashwell recently, "I cannot tell you the value that your concert parties have been to Malta. They have kept the men in hospital cheerful, and I am sure that a great deal of the excellent discipline that has been maintained here is owing to the interest the men have taken in attending your performances." From Egypt comes another appreciation from General Dobell, who writes, "The Lena Ashwell concert party has given concerts at all posts where it was in any way possible to allow them to go. And the fact that the ordinary rules were waived and special permission granted them to travel where no civilian in any circumstances had previously been allowed to go will make it clear to you how high a value we attach to their entertainments." A touching account was recently given of an incident at a concert in the Sinai Desert. Some soldiers in a camp 10 miles away, unable to obtain leave, were so much disappointed that they induced the Royal Engineers to lay some telephone wires, by which means these men in the distant camp were able to listen to the concert. Innumerable letters and testimonies to the success of her work have reached Miss Ashwell from all ranks and all branches of the Army. Generals, commanding officers, doctors, chaplains of all denominations unite in saying that the concert parties are accomplishing work of real military value. Countless have been the letters of appreciation from the soldiers themselves. In spite of its rapid and enormous increase, Miss Ashwell has continued to organize the work in a personal and vital way. Not only has she frequently been abroad giving performances herself, but she has personally engaged all the artistes for the parties and has supervised their complicated traveling arrangements. Moreover, she has raised the entire funds to maintain the scheme by addressing meetings and making known the work, which has thus been carried on entirely by voluntary contributions. Miss Ashwell has her thanks in the delight of thousands who have been cheered and helped by the efforts of the organization, which she has truly made her own. The great message that the music has brought to the soldiers is well expressed by a medical officer who wrote to her recently, "You do help us by heartening the men up and sending them back to the firing line happy and with the feeling that those at home do care, are with them, and are trying to help." 16. Miss Violetta Thurston. Miss Violetta Thurston has had a career as varied and adventurous as any nurse during the war, and she has certainly used to full advantage the great opportunities which have come to her. Trained at the London Hospital, Miss Thurston was fully qualified to take up responsible work when the war broke out, and in August 1914, she was sent to Brussels in charge of a contingent of nurses from the St. John Ambulance Association. Arriving just before the capture of the city, she witnessed the historical entry into Brussels of the German army. Some days later, when the German authorities asked for volunteers to nurse at a little town called Marceline near Charleroi, Miss Thurston offered to go and took 2 nurses with her leaving the remainder of her contingent in Brussels hospitals. At Marceline, Miss Thurston was in charge of a hospital under the German military command, where she nursed Belgian, French, and German wounded for some weeks under very trying conditions, aggravated by the brutality of the German system of discipline, even as regards her own wounded. After a period of work, Miss Thurston was granted leave of absence from the Marceline Hospital in order to look after the nurses she had left in and near Brussels. She had some exciting adventures, particularly when trying to find a nurse in an outlying village, where she actually got into the German lines and became involved in an outpost action. By this time, the Germans had decided that no English nurses were to be allowed to continue nursing in Belgium. So instead of returning, as she had expected, to the hospital at Marceline, Miss Thurston was obliged to spend some weeks of painful and anxious suspense waiting in Brussels, not knowing what fate was in store for her nurses and herself. Finally, together with about 100 other nurses from different contingents and some medical men, she was taken by train through Germany to the Danish frontier. During the journey, the nurses were subjected to constant insult and humiliation. At Copenhagen, however, these unpleasant experiences were made up for by a cordial reception. Miss Thurston was about to return to England when she heard of the great need for trained nurses in Russia, and after obtaining permission from England to offer her services to the Russian Red Cross, she traveled from Copenhagen to Petrograd. Miss Thurston started work at once. After nursing for a time in base hospitals and learning some Russian, she joined a flying ambulance column of motor cars, which moved from place to place at the front. One of the base hospitals in which she was quartered was at Warsaw, where, in spite of the great difference between Russian and English hospital methods, Miss Thurston managed to adapt herself to the conditions. She was then sent on to Lodz, where she had many adventures in the bombardment. Some idea of the work may be gathered from the fact that in the Russian retreat from Lodz, over 18,000 wounded were evacuated in 4 days, during which time the nurses worked practically without rest under terrible conditions. Miss Thurston's life with the workers of the motor ambulance unit was remarkable. They were always on the move and only just behind the front trenches, using any available building as a hospital. At one place they worked in a theater attached to a hunting box belonging to the ex-Tsar, and of the work there, Miss Thurston wrote, "The scenery had never been taken down after the last dramatic performance, and wounded men lay everywhere between the wings and drop scenes. The auditorium was packed so closely that you could hardly get between the men as they lay on the floor." At another dressing station established near the trenches, 750 patients passed through the hands of the small unit in little over 24 hours. Miss Thurston was shortly afterwards wounded when attending to soldiers in the trenches, and as pleurisy developed later, she had to give up work for a time and come home to England. Before leaving Russia, she was awarded the Medal of St. George for courage and devotion. In 1915, Miss Thurston returned to Russia on work of a different character, to assist in organizing the hospital units which were being sent from England to work among the refugees. For 3 months, she traveled all through the country, inspecting the arrangements which had been made in Petrograd, Moscow, Kiev, Kazan, Nizhny, and the remote districts to cope with the bewildering influx of over 5 million dazed and terrified people who fled from their homes before the great German advance into Russia. As a result of Miss Thurston's inquiries and the information which she was able to obtain, several units with doctors, nurses, and supplies were sent out to Russia and have done fine work for the refugees. Help for these unfortunate victims of war was badly needed, for their numbers were so overwhelming and their conditions so appalling that in spite of the noble effort made by the Russian authorities to cope with an immense problem, many difficulties connected with the welfare of the refugees continued to arise. Writing of them, Miss Thurston said, "Verily, the English language lacks words to express the suffering that these people underwent, and nothing that we can imagine could be worse than the reality." On returning to England, Miss Thurston was engaged for a time in organizing and secretarial work for the National Union of Trained Nurses. She was then asked to accept the post of matron at Hôpital des Loisirs at Le Pen in Belgium, where she is still on duty. This hospital has over 1,000 beds occupied by patients of Belgian, French, English, German, and even Russian nationality. It is established 5 miles from the front, so the work is far more acute than is usual in a base hospital, the severest cases being dealt with straight from the trenches. Miss Thurston presides over a staff of Belgian and English sisters and VADs under Belgian doctors. Such, then, has been Miss Thurston's war service, as fine a record of achievement in the cause of suffering humanity as any woman can show. Not the least wonderful fact about her is that Miss Thurston is very frail and has always been delicate. Only her spirit and pluck have carried her through and enabled her to do the hardest work under the roughest conditions. Writing of her, a friend says, "There is no doubt that Violetta Thurston is a woman with a touch of genius, and with, as well, a great devotion to work, not an everyday combination. She has determination and courage in an unusual degree, and is gifted with imagination and a deep sense of beauty. Nevertheless, she can drudge." Miss Thurston was recently decorated by the King in recognition of her devoted services. End of section 7. Section 8 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 17. Her Royal Highness Princess Beatrice, the Honorable Lady Lolly G.B.E., and the Countess of Gosford. Women's share has indeed been magnificent in the work of equipping the hospitals with bandages, garments, stores, and comforts of all descriptions. In the first week of the war, it is no exaggeration to say that there was hardly a woman in the kingdom who was not making something for the sick and wounded. But organizations stepped in at once to direct and systematize their efforts, and the main work has been carried on under the auspices of Queen Mary's Needlework Guild and the joint societies of the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John. Queen Mary's Needlework Guild was inaugurated the day after war was declared, and in response to an appeal by Her Majesty the Queen to the women of England, consignments of garments and comforts soon began to flow in. The headquarters of the Guild were established at Friary Court, St. James's Palace, under the direction of the Honorable Lady Lawley, who has acted as honorary organizing secretary throughout. In the rooms of the old palace, which formerly glittered with all the splendor of the King's state levees, mountains of garments and hospital necessaries were soon piled up. The organization has developed until now it stretches round the world, and the stream of supplies has continued with an ever-increasing volume. In the United Kingdom, 470 branches have been formed since the work of the Guild was initiated. From overseas, the response to Her Majesty's appeal has been even more remarkable. 70 branches and many sub-branches have been established in even the remotest corners of the earth, and the work which they have done and the number of garments which they have sent in to Friary Court have been no less even than the vast quantities which have been supplied by the workers in the United Kingdom. The number of garments received at headquarters is now approaching 5.5 millions, of which over 5.25 millions have been dispatched. The record was established when, in one especially busy week, 250,000 garments were sent off. These figures do not include the enormous consignments received at and dispatched from many of the branches working on independent lines. Hospitals at home and abroad, convalescent homes, British military and medical units in Europe, Africa, and Mesopotamia, the Navy, the Allied forces, the Belgian refugees, the prisoners of war, are some of the recipients of gifts from this great distributing center at Friary Court, for the sympathies of the Guild are as Catholic as its friends and supporters are widespread. Daily reports of the work are submitted to Her Majesty the Queen, who has thus kept in close touch with all the details of the organization. Lady Lawley and a large staff of voluntary workers have labored unsparingly throughout and are responsible in a great measure for the ready help which has been granted on so many sides. The following extract from a letter from a high authority in France is a typical tribute. In this past fortnight, the demand has been unprecedented, and I have been able to meet every requirement. I can never be grateful enough to the Guild. I don't think any of us can ever thank the work parties half enough for their very useful help. The largest surgical branch of Queen Mary's Needlework Guild is at the Central War Hospital Supply Depot, where truly inspiring work is being done in the making of hospital requirements. The depot was founded in April 1915 by Miss Ethel McCall, RRC, who originated and developed the system of work. When at the end of that year Miss McCall resigned, Her Royal Highness Princess Beatrice graciously undertook to carrying on the work of the depot and appointed Mrs. E.H. Gibson as her general manager. The workers attached to this depot number 3,500, and their service is entirely voluntary. There is no obligation to work for any stated time, but each worker is free to come for as long and as often as possible. Though the majority are part-time workers, there is a nucleus of steady plodders who come all day and every day. With woman's infallible instinct of dressing for her part, an optional but universally adopted uniform is worn in the depot, a white linen overall and a flowing white coif, which give the workrooms a charming and picturesque aspect. Each worker pays a subscription of 1 shilling a week, which, besides covering the house expenses of the depot, makes a considerable contribution towards the cost of materials and packing. Apart from this maintenance fund, money for the work has been entirely provided by voluntary gifts. This central depot has been the parent of a great organization which has spread throughout the country. Till now, 220 branches have been established in the United Kingdom. Thus, the work has grown and extended till there is hardly a town of importance where the host of women who have too many home ties to give themselves entirely to war work may yet devote whatever time they can to making hospital requisites under skilled instruction. The Central Depot issues patterns to its branches, and only work up to a high standard is passed for the hospitals. Marvels of ingenuity have been evolved in the way of bandages. The modern bandage is constructed with a view to making dressings as easy and painless as possible, and it can be put on with the minimum of movement for the patient. Sterilization of dressings is a great feature, and all sterilized goods are carefully packed in paper, afterwards hermetically sealed in waterproof cases, actually in the sterilizing room, thus rendering them ready for immediate use on being unpacked. Visitors cannot help being struck by the professional aspect of the work, whether they are looking at the complicated and beautifully sewn bandages, the well-made garments, or the perfectly packed parcels. Though the workers are volunteers, there is none of that amateur aspect which is apt to be associated with volunteer work. Altogether, many hundred hospitals have been supplied, most of which are in receipt of regular consignments. The branch depots are encouraged to send their products to local hospitals, but they also forward a certain amount to the central depot. The output from this depot last year reached over 3 million articles, such as bandages, surgical dressings, splints, clothing, and slippers. Such a successful and invaluable organization is one of which all the women concerned may be justly proud. The practical assistance of Her Royal Highness Princess Beatrice, which entails her almost daily presence at the depot and actual work in the bandage department, has added greatly to the satisfactory results. The general manager has given silent proof of her own capacity in the achievements of the entire organization. Such work can only be carried on if it is managed with infinite tact, foresight, and energy. At Mulberry Walk, Chelsea, another depot is doing particularly helpful work. The special feature of this branch is the Department for Light Splints and Supports, made in papier-mâché to fit exactly the casts of individual patients' limbs taken by the workers. Some of these women are sculptresses whose experience in their own profession has accustomed them to the handling of plaster for the casts and the subsequent modeling of the splints. The lightness and perfect fit of these splints make them of the greatest comfort to the wearers, and their beneficial effect has been remarkable. Under the joint societies of the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John, another great organization has been established, which has its headquarters at the Central Workrooms at Burlington House, where work is carried on under the presidency of the Countess of Gosford. The organization is divided into 4 main branches, which include the work carried on actually at the Central Workrooms, the work of the branch depots and working parties, the home workers, and the Department for Supplying Patterns. At the Central Workrooms, nearly 1,000 voluntary workers have been enrolled, who have produced a total of over 350,000 articles, which include a large proportion of bandages, besides hospital garments. In addition to this, a large number of garments and bandages have been made and supplied as patterns to the working parties. The pattern department has also issued thousands of paper patterns, books, and directions. Asked to register at the Central Workrooms and so to form a part of this great national organization, these working parties, which number over 2,000, have established a truly wonderful record. It is impossible to give even an approximate idea of the total of the vast supplies of hospital necessaries which they have produced. But recent returns from only 975 of the working parties over a period of about 18 months show the astonishing output of nearly 5.5 million of articles for hospital use. Such figures show that women of the country, to whom more conspicuous service has been denied, have indeed achieved miracles of devoted industry. In recognition of their work, the Central Workrooms issues special certificates and also distributes government badges on application by the responsible heads to members of these working parties who have produced a specified output, and there are today close on 40,000 workers who may be justified in showing with pride these tributes of recognition. The scope of these registered working parties is worldwide and stretches from Portugal to the West Indies, from Sierra Leone to California, from New Zealand to Panama. Other contributors to the supplies of the Central Workrooms are the registered home workers, who have produced a great output of needlework, besides innumerable contributions for hospital use of games, books, stationery, musical instruments, etc. Lady Gosford is controlling a department of which she and her helpers may well feel proud, and it is largely owing to the fine stimulus from headquarters that the total records have been so satisfactory. In a great department in the British Red Cross Society's buildings, weekly deliveries of all the work made and collected by the Central Workrooms are received, together with countless other gifts of hospital comforts from all over the world. Here, the miscellaneous collection is sorted and dispatched according to the requests from the hospitals by a voluntary staff who have been working under Lady Sophie Scott for nearly 3 years. The goods are packed and sent not only to the hospitals in Britain and in France, but to all the remoter theaters of war: Malta, Egypt, Salonika, Mesopotamia, Palestine. Besides sending to British hospitals, large gifts have been made to the sick and wounded of the Allies. At a similar depot for the receiving and dispatch of hospital equipment and comforts, another devoted group of workers under Lady Jekyll has worked at this labor of love since the earliest days of the war, near the ancient buildings of St. John's Gate. Here, the St. John workers of the country send their contributions, and goods of all sorts are dispatched to hospitals at home and abroad. The neat shelves and cupboards contain everything that the sick soldiers may want, from warm bed jackets and sleeping suits to toothbrushes and soap, while extras such as riding materials and games are frequently among the gifts. The Red Cross and St. John depots each supply a separate group of hospitals, and it is indeed a proud achievement that they have been able, throughout the war, to keep pace with requirements on such an enormous scale. If the complete history ever comes to be written of the work of women with their needles during the war, it will reveal an astounding record of patient, loyal, skillful achievement, and an output of which the figures can only be described as phenomenal. 18. Miss Edith Holden, RRC. I wonder if patients entering the receiving hall of this hospital realize how much they owe to the Lady of the Lamp, whose statue has been lent us for the war. Colonel Bruce Porter, in command of the 3rd London General Hospital Territorial Forces, wrote the above recently in an appreciation of Florence Nightingale and the great sisterhood of nurses which she founded. From the original 125 nurses, the total under her control by the end of the Crimean War, has sprung the wonderful organization which is nobly carrying on the noblest of all women's work. To see one of our great military hospitals today is indeed an inspiring sight. To walk through the bright, airy wards, to glance into the spotless theaters, to watch the preparation of appetizing meals in the big kitchens, and to examine some of the modern scientific developments induce a sense of deep interest in which emotions of pity and sympathy are overwhelmed in the predominant atmosphere of thankfulness and hope. But it is not till a visitor has been privileged to enter matron's office and to be shown in the beautifully kept ledgers the system of organization that a true understanding can be reached of how it is that the work of this great hospital seems to run so smoothly and with none of the restlessness and bustle which are associated with undertakings on a large scale. Miss Edith Holden has been matron of the 3rd London General Hospital since August 1914. One of the biggest military hospitals in the country, it contains over 2,000 beds, of which 550 are for officers. It is certainly the largest collection of beds controlled by one matron, for in other of the larger military hospitals, the patients are in different buildings, each containing several hundred beds and having its own matron, though all under one commanding officer. The original building was the Royal Victoria Patriotic School for Soldiers' Orphans, but as the hospital has increased, a town of wooden huts has sprung up around the central stone edifice. Miss Holden had had considerable hospital experience in peacetime, having been matron at the Richmond Hospital, Dublin, and assistant matron at Chelsea Infirmary. To her skill and power of organization, much of the success of the hospital is due. She presides over a staff of women numbering 520, which includes fully trained nurses, VAD probationers, women orderlies, clerks, cooks, and scrubbers. And if she had no other duties, the control of this department alone would be a fair day's work. The standard of nursing expected at the base hospitals in England is considerably higher than abroad, where the patient often feels he is merely resting on his way home. Bed sores are not always avoidable abroad, writes a well-known army doctor, but they must never occur in a hospital in England. The shortage of trained nurses makes the maintenance of this high standard no easy matter. We have only 2/5 of the number of trained nurses laid down in the establishment as authorized by the War Office schedule before the war, Miss Holden stated recently, and even this nucleus is liable to be drawn upon for foreign service. This involves considerable strain on the matron and her assistants. There remains as supplementary staff the great band of untrained VAD workers, from amongst whom the more experienced probationers are constantly transferred abroad. Miss Holden was one of the first matrons to welcome VAD helpers at the beginning of the war, and the care which she has bestowed on rendering them efficient and skillful nurses has been one of the most helpful factors in the smooth working of the hospital. Another of Miss Holden's multifarious duties is the responsibility of catering for the officer patients and the women's staff. The management of this branch of the work demands brains as well as imagination. While the soldiers must receive the dainty diet which sick men need, food supplies must be closely watched, wastage avoided, and expenditure controlled. The happy and human atmosphere of the hospital speaks volumes for the personality of those in authority. Every aspect gives evidence of deep thought, sympathy, and understanding for the welfare of the sick soldiers. The spirit of progress is felt on all sides. To give only one instance, several of the masseurs in attendance are soldiers blinded in the war who have been trained for this work. And, says the commanding officer, after the war, no one must employ any other masseurs but blind soldiers. A wonderful new branch of work is the facial department. Lieutenant Derwentwood, by the use of metal plates, has achieved miracles of restoration for those most unhappy of all maimed soldiers who suffer from apparently hopeless, disfiguring facial wounds. He uses his skill as a sculptor to model these masks for cases in which surgery cannot restore the missing part. Yet a further and very human branch of the matron's special, though unofficial, activities is the care of the relatives who are sent for by the medical officers to see the dangerously ill cases. These unfortunate people arrive, many from remote parts of the country, never having been in London before, and the matron has made it her duty to find accommodation near the hospital to which they can be sent. The story of the matron's day is an endless chronicle, ceaseless care for the critical cases under her charge, 100 daily problems to be solved in organization of personnel, stores, equipment, not forgetting entertainments, which form a great feature. Besides coping with the daily round, she must always maintain an open mind for fresh ideas and arrangements and new experiments in nursing. Above all, she must keep the serenity, rapidity of decision, firmness, and sense of humor which are essential in her responsible office. Miss Holden manages to combine these qualities. She is a woman who must be obeyed without question, but who may yet be approached by the humblest worker in the hospital with the certainty of finding sympathy and justice. Work in a base hospital is perhaps the most unselfish of all hospital work today. There is none of the excitement and constant change of the work nearer to the front. Day by day, the routine of the wards goes on, unceasing in its calls on body and mind, unending in its responsibility, demanding and receiving in its fulfillment the best that women know how to give. Colonel Bruce Porter paid his women workers a well-earned compliment when he reported recently, "Since the early days of the war, the standard of nursing and care of the wards has been maintained by means of the loyalty of the reduced staff to their chiefs, and the whole of the women here have been and are magnificent. to keep this big crowd of women workers at their best could only be done by a woman of exceptional ability, and I am fortunate in having that type of woman as my matron. End of Section 8. Section 9 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 19. Mrs. Gaskell, CBE, and the Honorable Mrs. Anstruther. The supply of literature to our soldiers has been an undertaking of gigantic proportions. It was a woman who, in the first few days of war, had the insight and imagination to realize the part that books would play in the soldiers' lives, and the organizations for their supply, which have grown up to keep pace with the ever-increasing demand, have been carried on almost entirely by women workers. The collection and distribution of books to the troops is now undertaken mainly by 4 organizations. The camp's library works under the War Office to supply the troops, quartered both at home and in every theater of war abroad. The War Library of the Joint Societies of the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John supplies the sick and wounded soldiers in hospitals, hospital trains, and hospital ships. The Chamber of Commerce supplies the Grand Fleet, and the British and Foreign Sailors Society sends to the merchant ships and smaller ships. The need for books in hospitals speaks for itself, while for our fighting men, reading is often the only form of recreation. In the various theaters of war abroad, they are entirely dependent for reading matter on what may be sent to them from home. The need for light literature and fiction is endless, to turn their thoughts from horror or the monotony of war. The ways in which the books are obtained are many and varied. After some months of war, the question of keeping up the supply for distribution by the libraries became a momentous one. At first, the newspaper appeals brought in many thousands of volumes. Financial contributions for buying books were sent, and generous gifts were received from publishers. But these supplies could not continue indefinitely on a sufficiently large scale. A wonderful solution to the problem came in August 1915. The Postmaster General, Mr. Herbert Samuel, was struck on visiting some of the camps and on seeing the men in the trenches by the great value to them of the books already sent out. It occurred to him that the post offices of the country might be used to become collecting depots for the libraries, and in consultation with Colonel Sir Edward Ward and the Honorable Mrs. Anstruther, a scheme was evolved by which anyone could hand a book or magazine, unwrapped and unaddressed, over the counter of any post office in the kingdom for the benefit of our soldiers. The collections thus made are divided in agreed proportions between the 4 societies already mentioned. The War Library started work quickly. In the first week of war, Mrs. Gaskell, her brother Mr. Beresford Melville, and a small group of friends made an appeal in the newspapers for literature for the sick and wounded. This was the first of all the great war appeals. The response was so rapid and so overwhelming that even in the large house lent by Lady Battersea for the accommodation of the books, problems of space and of methods of distribution at once arose. But a satisfactory system was quickly evolved, and with the assistance of Dr. Hagberg Wright, librarian of the London Library, it has developed into an organization of clockwork perfection. Started early as a private undertaking, the War Library reached such proportions that by November 1915 it was considered advisable to affiliate it to the Joint Societies of the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John, thus ensuring financial support and official facilities of distribution. The work, however, has been carried on throughout by Mrs. Gaskell and a voluntary staff of women helpers, whose duties include the unpacking and sorting of the books, the cleaning and mending of soiled and torn copies, the selection of books by a careful system which ensures that each package shall contain a choice of books and magazines to suit varied types of readers, and the packing, addressing, and dispatch to the hospitals. Under the present arrangements, 1,810 hospitals are supplied in England, and a fortnightly consignment of books is sent to 272 hospitals in France, besides the cross-channel hospital service and hospital ships for the colonies and foreign service. Hospitals in East Africa, Bombay, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Salonika, and Malta receive every month thousands of books and magazines, the continuous supply traveling smoothly to its destination of ambulance, casualty clearing station, or base hospital. Under the post office scheme, several thousand books, papers, and magazines are received weekly. But in addition, many gifts of books are sent direct to the War Library. There is also a large department of the War Library for the purchase of new books to mix with those given. A touching and remarkably successful feature, a suggestion of Mr. Rudyard Kipling, is a thin scrapbook for men who are very ill, made by devoted helpers amongst the public, in answer to a special appeal. A small department for games and puzzles has also been started in response to urgent requests from the hospitals. Efforts are always made by the workers at the War Library to meet the individual needs of special cases brought to their notice, and this personal touch with patients in hospital is of infinite value. Men with long months of life in bed before them have been enabled by means of the books thus provided to study for particular professions and trades. It is our special boast, says Mrs. Gaskell, that no request for literature has ever been refused by the War Library, even to selecting and packing 20,000 books in 24 hours, or again such a request as we had from no less than 3 colonial hospitals who asked for the Encyclopedia Britannica in 40 volumes. The effects of the work of the War Library are so far-reaching as to be incalculable. It is safe to say that no small group of women, such as Mrs. Gaskell and her helpers, could have done more throughout the war to cheer the lonely and depressed, to amuse and interest the weary, and to turn the minds of men in pain to fresh channels which help them to forget their suffering. The work of the camp's library was started in October 1914 and now consists of the colossal task of providing a systematic and regular supply of literature to the whole of the British Army. No application is necessary. A box or bale, varying in quantity according to the number of men, is sent out automatically about once every month or 6 weeks to every unit, however small, in every theater of war. The scheme was originated by Colonel Sir Edward Ward when making arrangements for the reception of the overseas troops on Salisbury Plain. He then saw how necessary it was for the men to have books and magazines, and he asked the Honorable Mrs. Anstruther to assist him in forming libraries for the use of the men in their leisure hours to relieve the monotony of the long evenings in isolated camps. From this comparatively small beginning, the present system has grown up, and now every commanding officer can form a lending library of bound books for the use of his men in every camp or regimental institute at home or abroad. These libraries of bound books are, in addition to the bales of general literature which go out from the camp's library to all units serving with the British Expeditionary Force, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, and the Indian Expeditionary Force. Each box or bale contains the greatest possible variety of literature, from a classic or standard novel to the most highly colored penny novelette. Magazines and picture papers are always included. In fact, there is in each box sufficient variety to suit all tastes. Books and magazines are passed from unit to unit till they literally fall to pieces. For the life of a book under war conditions cannot be a long one, and the request for more is loud and persistent. Besides these automatic consignments, special applications may be made by the chaplains of all denominations attached to the armies in every theater of war, who then receive for distribution fortnightly boxes in England or France, or monthly bales on the remoter fronts. The camp's library also supplies light literature to those soldiers whose need is greater than any others, the prisoners of war. And large libraries have been formed at most of the prisoners' camps in Germany. Prisoners' literature is further supplied under the Board of Education, which has started a special department for sending them books on educational and technical subjects, and prisoners' individual requests are dealt with there. When it is realized that since the beginning of the war, over 9 million publications have been handled at the camp's library, some idea of the scope of the work may be gained. It speaks worlds for Mrs. Anstruther's powers that she has been able to establish a smooth-running organization on such a gigantic scale. But she and her helpers are more than rewarded for their efforts in the realization of how much their work has meant to the soldiers. Appreciation and thanks pour in from all parts of the world. The reception of the books can be best described in a soldier's own words. It was a very wet day, and most of the men were lying or sitting about with nothing to do. When I said I had a box of books to lend, they were round me in a moment like a lot of hounds at a worry, and in less than no time each had got a book, at least as far as they would go round. Those who hadn't been quick enough were trying to get the lucky ones to read aloud. It would have done you good to see how the men enjoy getting the books. Can we have more, as many more as you can spare? Another officer writes, "My battery has been in action since the beginning of November 1914, and I can honestly say that no enterprise, public or private, has helped us more to keep the men amused and contented than the books sent by the camp's library." Letters such as these are eloquent testimony to workers whose labor has accomplished such a fine achievement. 20. Miss Lillian Russell and Miss Alice Brown. Miss Lillian Russell and Miss Alice Brown are amongst the ladies who are working in one of the branches of the YMCA work in France, the hostels for the relatives of the wounded. The medical officers in the various hospitals in France are empowered to telegraph to the parents, wife, or sweetheart of any soldier whose condition they consider critical. At the request of the military authorities, the YMCA undertook nearly 2 years ago the work of meeting, housing, and caring for the relatives during their stay. The sight of their own people has undoubtedly saved the lives of many patients by reviving their desire to live, even in cases which the doctors had thought to be hopeless. Many women are giving themselves with the utmost devotion to the work of managing these hostels. The following accounts are given as typical workers' experiences. Miss Alice Brown and her sister, Mrs. Ballantyne, have been in charge of a hostel for many months, and no more poignant human experience can be imagined. At the end of 10 months, over 1,200 people had stayed with them, though there is accommodation for only about 20 people at a time. Miss Brown and Mrs. Ballantyne look over their visitors entirely during their stay, and with 2 or 3 voluntary helpers, they keep the house and cook for a household which sometimes numbers 50. Writing of her life at the hostel, Miss Brown says, "We have all our meals with our visitors, and family prayers after breakfast bring a quaint and cosmopolitan household together. They come from all parts of Great Britain and Ireland, There are also wives who have followed their husbands from Canada to England, and brothers of New Zealand and Australian boys who have been sent straight down from the line. They stay with us as long as the OC at the hospital thinks necessary. The patients are not usually told that their relations are coming until they are actually on the spot, and then great are the joys of meeting. Sometimes visitors have stayed with Miss Brown at the hostel for many weeks, and on one occasion a baby was born there whose mother had come out to see her badly wounded husband. From time to time there come the tragedies of the relations who arrive too late, and then it is that the ladies of the hostels can comfort and befriend these poor stricken people, go with them to the military funeral, and help them return to England. Indeed, it is mostly sad work, for the relatives are sent for only in the very dangerous cases, and sometimes they stay on through weeks of anguish and suspense. But Miss Brown strives to keep up an atmosphere of cheerfulness and courage, following the wonderful examples from the hospital wards, and there is an unwritten law in the hostel that no one must break down. As an illustration, Miss Brown once described an occasion when she found a girl sobbing bitterly in the hostel sitting room. On asking what was the matter, she was told that the girl's brother was to have his foot amputated. "Oh, that's nothing," said Miss Brown, and was astonished afterwards when she had comforted her visitor at what must have seemed heartlessness on her part. But the loss of a foot is indeed nothing as compared with many cases. Miss Russell's work is somewhat different in character, for the hostel she manages is at one of the chief bases and is the clearing station at which all the relatives coming to France arrive. From this base, they are then posted on to the various hospitals, some having to be sent 80 miles by motor. The work here is very strenuous, for it means perpetual comings and goings, and there are always 20 to 30 relatives resident at this hostel, besides those who pass through. The workers can never, at any hour of the day or night, feel safe from fresh arrivals, for whom food and accommodation have to be provided pending the uncertain departures of boats and trains. Miss Russell reports that in most cases the relatives are touchingly grateful. A welcome for all who come is never lacking, but the work of hostel helpers is exhausting, physically and mentally, and relentless in its demands on their sympathy. One of Miss Russell's privileges is a permit giving her the entry into all the hospitals so that she is able to keep in touch with some of the soldiers after their people have returned, if they are, as she says, homesick and in need of a little extra spoiling. In a letter to a friend, she writes, "The opportunities this bit of one's work gives are inestimable, and the example of the patient, faithful work the sisters do is the greatest help and comfort. Everything, I think, pales before their glory, second only to that of the soldiers in courage, sacrifice, and devotion. As to the men themselves, I can't write of what they almost all are, how self-forgetful, modest, and unselfish down to the very gates of death. To those who wait in the shadow of suspense and anxiety which hangs over so many English homes, it is indeed a consolation to know that if their soldier should be lying in danger, his own people will be able to go to him. This privilege is available for rich and poor alike, the government being responsible for the cost of their journey and visit, however long the relations may stay." 21. Miss Dorothy Matthews and Miss Ursula Windsor. At a great women's meeting held recently in London, Mr. Prothero, the Minister of Agriculture, used the following words: "I do not pretend that work on the land is attractive to many women. It is hard work, fatiguing, back-aching, monotonous, dirty work in all sorts of weather. It is poorly paid, the accommodation is rough, and those who undertake it have to face physical discomforts. In all respects, it is comparable to the work your menfolk are doing in the trenches at the front. It is not a case of lilac sunbonnets. There is no romance in it. It is prose. But in spite of all the difficulties which agricultural work presents for women, they are taking it up in ever-increasing numbers in view of the country's necessity. The success of women in agriculture is largely due to a splendid organization, the Women's National Land Service Corps, formed privately but now working in close cooperation with the government departments. This corps first advertised the necessity for the employment of women on the land and initiated opportunities for their training on a large scale. Miss Dorothy Matthews and Miss Margaret Hughes are two typical workers, educated women used to comfortable surroundings, who have come forward to fill the places of the men who have gone to fight. Miss Matthews and Miss Hughes are engaged in the heaviest forms of agricultural work, which, however, they report to be quite within the power of women. The healthy outdoor life and the work itself naturally tend to increase strength. And, said Miss Matthews recently, we are astonished at the ease with which we do things that seemed almost impossible some months ago. The usual farm day starts with milking, and when this is done, the serious work begins, varying according to the season of the year. The field work is, of course, the heaviest, but Miss Matthews and Miss Hughes each takes out her own team of horses for the plowing and harrowing, and as they are working in a very hilly part of the country, in Herefordshire, this is exceptionally hard. Writing to a friend recently, Miss Hughes said, "On our first morning at the farm, we were put straight on to plowing a field up on the hills, with a glorious view across the Wye Valley and right onto the Malvern Hills. Happily, we managed quite well, though we were in a blue funk, having only our 1 month of training college experience to go on. We went on plowing practically every day, and our last piece of work before the frost set in was to help plow up an 8-acre piece that had been under grass for 11 years. It was a business. As well as plowing and sowing the fields, these girls do manure carting and spreading, grinding, and root pulling. They also groom the horses, mix the food, feed the stock, and clean out the cowsheds and stables." Describing another branch of her work recently, Miss Matthews wrote, "During the severe weather we had a strenuous time thrashing. All hands were requisitioned, and the engine was kept going from 7:30 a.m. till 6 p.m., with only an hour's break for lunch." This, of course, meant very hard days and long hours, not to mention the dust. Miss Hughes and I were put on to pitching from the rick, and mighty strenuous work it is. It was amusing to discover that we had the most tiring job. Naturally, there wasn't a rush for it by those who knew. In addition to their farm work, Miss Matthews and Miss Hughes do their own cooking and housework. Therefore, they are really doing a man's work outside, but without the prepared meal and the immediate rest that most men can look forward to after work. Another branch of agriculture which women are beginning to take up with success is work with heavy motor tractors. Miss Ursula Windsor and Miss Molly Jameson are good examples of women who do this sort of work. These girls have been driving a tractor plow in Shropshire. They volunteered for the work at a time when the local farmers were in despair at their inability to use the only tractor in the district, the last available driver having been called up for military service. The girls had had some experience of motors, Miss Windsor having been chauffeur and odd man when working as a VAD in a hospital at the beginning of the war. She was not accustomed, however, to a type of car of which the starting handle alone weighs many pounds. Moreover, in order to be taken along a road from one field to another, a tractor requires to have the spuds taken off the wheels. These are strips of steel put on with 2 bolts and nuts each, and there are 12 spuds on each wheel, usually thickly covered with mud and oil, so their removal is no drawing room job. But Miss Windsor and her friend were not to be daunted. In spite of their lack of experience and further hampered by a large audience, which assembled in a spirit inclined to mockery to watch their efforts during their first days of work, they plowed on in the most literal sense, conquering their difficulties and gradually acquiring mastery over the tractor. Miss Windsor and Miss Jameson take the work of driving the tractor and managing the plow by turns, the former being very hot and the latter very cold work. They have now worked the tractor for some months, taking it over considerable distances to farms all through the district. They are able to plow from 4 to 5 acres of land in a day and have recently started training some of the local girls in this work. End of section 9. Section 10 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 22. Miss Evelyn Lynne and Miss Madge Gregg. In addition to their great hospital work, the Joint Societies of the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John have established many of what may be called the additional links in the long hospital chain which stretches with such perfect organization from the spot where the soldier is wounded on the battlefield to the point where he is able to return with renewed strength to duty. The accounts which follow of the experiences of two workers illustrate the similar lives of many other VADs. Miss Evelyn Lynne went to France in October 1914 as cook in the 1st Voluntary Aid Detachment to be sent abroad. The detachment was to start a rest station at one of the base railway stations for feeding and redressing the wounded as they came through in the hospital trains from the front. A series of railway luggage vans drawn up on a siding had to serve as the headquarters of the detachment, which Miss Lynne described as follows. We had very hard work and great fun scrubbing and disinfecting the vans. They looked beautiful when finished and were equipped as a kitchen, dispensary, dressing station, storeroom, and common room, respectively. No one would believe what a charming kitchen a railway truck made. Besides the kitchen, we had a very long fire burning between old railway lines arranged at the right distance to support the huge pots for making cocoa, 6 pots at a time, so that we could have enough for 300 boiling at once. We worked day and night at the rest station in 12-hour shifts, and being a humble cook, it was my lot to stand for hours over the fire stirring cocoa, sometimes in the pouring rain and with smoke belching into my eyes. As a rule, the rest station workers were given only an hour's warning of the arrival of a hospital train, and then had to prepare food for from 300 to 800 wounded men. When the trains came in, the workers would take their cauldrons of cocoa or soup and baskets of food on hand carts to the carriages. No words can ever express how splendid the wounded men were, wrote Miss Lynne. One never heard a complaint, and we were so thankful to be able to do just that little for them. Later, Miss Lynne was sent to cook for between 80 and 90 nurses at their billet in an old chateau at one of the hospital bases. This was hard work indeed, for she was the only cook and had 8 meals a day to serve. The nurses were on army rations, so a whole sheep or the quarter of a bullock would be left at the door daily, and Miss Lynne soon became an expert butcher. When later she had to return to England, she wrote, "I shall always look back on those days in France as the happiest time of my life." She is now working as an inspector of hostels under the Ministry of Munitions. Miss Madge Gregg had been doing rest station work since January 1915 and has been quartered at various stations on the lines of communication. Starting a new station entails hard work, and the workers need to show resource and quickness and the ability to adapt their arrangements on the instant to existing conditions, however inconvenient and uncomfortable they may be. Railway trucks or a goods shed have had to be transformed in a few hours into a spotlessly clean dressing station where men could be brought from the improvised ambulance trains to have their wounds redressed. On one occasion, the unit with which Miss Gregg was working received a message that unexpected special trains were on their way and could not be drawn up at the existing rest station. Within an hour, the workers managed to get their stores and apparatus moved round to another part of the line. And, writes Miss Gregg, by 7 a.m., we had everything in readiness within the new dressing station and 10 boilers of hot cocoa out near the trains. There followed days and nights of continuous hard work and more trains than ever before. This was our experience of the Battle of Loos. With time, the rest stations were housed in proper huts, and also as the number of fully equipped hospital trains increased, the need for dressings was no longer so urgent. A later development has been an arrangement for small wards at some of the rest stations where bad cases could be brought from the trains and 48-hour cases from among the local troops could be treated. In many ways, rest station duty is very trying, for the work is necessarily so unevenly divided. Times of rush come after the heavy fighting, when there is no respite by day or night. But the workers like Miss Gregg and her companions never spare themselves fatigue or effort. The only thing that matters is that no ambulance train should find them unprepared. No wound should suffer for want of fresh dressing. No cold, tired soldier should be disappointed of his hot drink. The rushes are followed by long periods when there is hardly enough work to fill the day, and the girls become conscious of the grim, drafty surroundings of the railway station, which form the entire horizon of their life. They have, however, found many other little ways of service, such as undertaking all the laundry arrangements for the sisters nursing permanently on the ambulance trains, starting a lending library, and doing little things for the soldiers on the leave trains. It is just in the doing of these little things that Red Cross workers, amongst whom Miss Gregg and Miss Lynne are typical, are performing such valuable service. There is little excitement and no limelight in a life such as they lead, and it entails hard work at any hour of the day or night whenever they may happen to be called upon. But their reward lies in the moments of cheer and brightness which they have been able to bring to so many thousands of suffering men, in that never-ending procession of pain ebbing away from the battlefields. Their kind ministrations have changed a dreary wait in a cold, dull station into an episode that soldiers who have passed through will remember with thankfulness, a moment of respite, bringing new courage, warmth, and comfort when all were sorely needed. 23. Mrs. Leach. In the summer of 1915, the Women's Legion, a war organization started by Lady Londonderry, represented to the War Office that the services of women might be used in cooking for the troops. Various obvious advantages were connected with the suggestion. There was only a limited and insufficient number of men trained as army cooks, and the introduction of women to do work which naturally falls within their sphere would thus release men for tasks which they alone are suited to undertake. It must also be a considerable gain to any troops to have their cooking managed by highly trained women able to devote their whole time to the work, rather than by men to whom this was only one of other military duties. As a result of these representations, permission was obtained in August 1915 for 100 cooks to start work as an experiment in certain of the military convalescent camps. Almost from the first, the work at the camp, where the largest number of women was employed, was carried on under the personal management of Mrs. Leach, who has been identified throughout with the movement. She is now in control of the great organization of women cooks for the Army, which has grown out of this tentative beginning. After a 6-month trial, the success of the experiment was assured, and not only had vast savings of food been made, but these were combined with marked improvement in the standard of camp cookery. As a result of this initial success, by February 1916, the Women's Legion was asked to extend its work, and in the course of the year that followed, the number of women employed in military cooking rose from the original 100 to over 7,000. When it is realized that the cooking for 1,000 men has to be done by a staff of only 13 or 14 women, including, besides actual cooks, kitchen helpers and waitresses, it will be readily admitted that their work is of an arduous nature. A difficulty might have been expected in finding a sufficient number of suitable women to respond to the ever-increasing demand. On the only occasion, however, when an advertisement was published asking for the services of 1,000 women to undertake this hard and not particularly well-paid work, no less than 28,000 applications were received. This fact alone is a remarkable testimony to the patriotic way in which women have come forward during the war to offer to their country the services for which their particular training has fitted them. The rapid development of this great organization owes much to the powers of judgment, tact, and management displayed by Mrs. Leach. For even in war conditions, it is always hard to introduce innovations without friction. Mrs. Leach has been helped in her work by her sister, Mrs. Long, who has been responsible for much of the detailed administrative organization. A large part of the office work, taking up of references and arrangements of posting, has been carried out by Mrs. Long, who has also supervised the issue of uniforms. Mrs. Leach has been personally responsible throughout for the engagement of most of the cooks and for their distribution. She inspects the cooking staffs from time to time, and all decisions for promotion go through her hands. A cook joining a camp staff in a subordinate position may rapidly rise to a post of head cook, one of considerable responsibility in these days. For not only is the economical use of the country's food supplies a matter of national urgency, but the good or bad feeding of the individual soldier is admitted by all authorities to have a strongly marked effect on his fighting power and efficiency. The satisfactory reports on the women cooks from officers and men's messes throughout the country prove how well the work has been done. But the clearest tribute of success came when, in February 1917, this branch of the Women's Legion, which had worked hitherto as a private organization in cooperation with the War Office, became incorporated actually in the Army as part of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. The value of Mrs. Leach's work was fully recognized, and she was asked to continue the management of the department under the new system. She is the first, however, to ascribe the real success of the work to the esprit de corps, the loyalty and the patriotism of the women themselves, who have shown their capacity to carry on women's most time-honored household duty under unexpected and increasingly important conditions. 24. Mrs. Graham Jones. The work of Mrs. Graham Jones, in charge of a woman's VAD motor ambulance unit in France, is remarkable in that this unit was the first of its kind, and as a result of this successful experiment, the employment of women as motor ambulance drivers for the British Army has been widely extended. Undoubtedly, this success was mainly due to Mrs. Graham Jones herself and her good organization and control of the contingent. Her record is typical of thousands of English girls of education and refinement who have come forward and given their services for work hitherto considered men's work, living hard lives under the strict army discipline enforced for all workers in France. In April 1916, the British Red Cross Society organized this motor unit to take over the entire work of a big base hospital in northern France. Mrs. Graham Jones, who was given the command, had had over 6 years' experience of motor driving and had already driven an ambulance during the early part of the war. Working under her were 13 girl drivers. The unit was attached to a hospital of 1,300 beds, 20 miles away from the port to and from which the patients had to be conveyed. The ambulance cars were big and powerful, and the girls had entire charge of them, not only for driving, but for cleaning and all except heavy repairs. Mrs. Graham Jones, writing up the work, says, "It included the unloading of hospital trains at our station, the transport of patients to the hospital ships, to convalescent camps, or to the base headquarters for return to duty, the conveyance of mails and stores, personnel, etc. It was always full of interest, but required at the same time careful driving and a steady, reliable head. The roads through the various camps were so new and so narrow, and the obstacles one met on them so varied in the way of teams of mules, army lorries, marching platoons, or steamrollers, that there could be no relaxation of concentration. When the heavy fighting on the Somme began, the hospital increased its accommodation, and the demand on motor transport was so continuous that the drivers were obliged to work in shifts of 8 hours on and 4 hours off to enable the work to be carried on night and day. During the rush, the girls were driving as much as 130 miles a day, but the care of the cars was never neglected, and it was the duty of the off-going driver always to leave her car ready for the road. A VAD officer inspecting the unit reported as follows. At 5:30 a.m., we were awakened by an orderly reporting that a train would be in the local station in 5 minutes. In 10 minutes, the members were pouring out of the house to fetch their cars from the garage and were at the station before unloading had begun. They drove very carefully, and we heard nothing but praise of them on all sides. It needs little imagination to realize the demands such work makes both on mind and body, for a girl must have her full share of self-control and nerve to be able to drive a load of wounded men across 20 miles of difficult road at night as well as by day, when she knows what an error in driving might mean to them, and that the slightest want of care on her part might cause them unnecessary suffering. After the patients are safely deposited, comes the hard work of cleaning and keeping the cars in order, a vital necessity for motor ambulances, for wounded men must not run the risk of delays on the road. In January 1917, Mrs. Graham Jones was mentioned in dispatches for her devoted service and the success with which she had run her unit during many months. Not the least important of the principles which she instilled into her fellow workers was strict and unquestioning obedience to army discipline. She quickly realized that in order to be of real help, one must fit into one's place in the great machine. It is because women have learnt during the war how important this question of discipline is that they are being employed for the first time and in ever-growing numbers on active service. Nurses who, throughout their training, have always worked under strict rules, adapt themselves naturally to war conditions. But for women who have never been accustomed to a disciplined life, unquestioning obedience is far harder. Writing of women's service in France, Mrs. Graham Jones says, "It is not that women would be afraid of danger. It is that after one has worked on active service for some time, one feels so much that one wants to do work only where the work is wanted. One just wants to help in ever so small a way, just where the help is needed, and in no case where extra trouble or responsibility is thrown on those in authority. This is surely the essence of helpfulness, and this is the spirit in which Mrs. Graham Jones and many others like her are working for their country today. End of section 10. Section 11 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 25. Miss Gertrude Shaw. When in the spring of 1915, the cry for shells and more shells was answered by an almost miraculous development of munition factories, it was hardly contemplated what an immense share women would be able to take in the production of the output. It soon became apparent, however, that the National Reserve of Labor lay with them. In their tens of thousands, women answered the appeal, in many cases leaving their homes to settle in munition areas where population was already congested or where housing accommodation was on the smallest scale. To maintain the efficiency of these new industrial workers, it was clear that steps must be taken to secure suitable provision for food and shelter. The problem indeed soon became acute in some centers, and wide experiments for the protection of the women workers were made. That the results have been so good is due to the exertion of certain individual women of forceful character and of organizing genius, and of these, Miss Gertrude Shaw is an outstanding figure. Trained from the outset of her life for the teaching profession, Miss Shaw rose to a headmistressship of a higher grade girls' school at Leeds, and proceeded in 1913 to fill the post of responsible mistress at the Women's Institute, Woolwich. Besides her literary and scientific qualifications, Miss Shaw had specialized in several domestic subjects, including laundry and cookery. She had also obtained the Royal Sanitary Institute's certificates as school nurse and health visitor. She was thus fully equipped for the task when the sudden war demand arose at Woolwich for the safeguarding of the health of women munition workers. The first necessity was the provision of adequate meals in the vicinity of the works. This demand was at once met by voluntary effort, and it was under the leadership of Lady Henry Grosvenor that Miss Shaw entered the service of the YMCA as superior of canteens. She was thus in at the birth of the first canteen for girl munition workers at the arsenal, and subsequently became responsible for the staff, catering, and equipment of 4 mess rooms. The success of these canteens soon led Miss Shaw's appointment to a wider sphere as Lady Superintendent of the newly erected government colony at Coventry. This scheme embraces the housing and feeding of some 6,000 girls and women drawn from every part of the United Kingdom. A group of hostels has been built, each housing 100 girls, and each is under the direction of a competent matron. As Lady Superintendent, Miss Shaw undertook the task of selection of all the matrons and their assistants, of the canteen managers and their subordinates, in all a staff of some 300 persons. It must be recalled that in the organization of the colony there was no precedent from which to take example, so each problem had to be met and solved as it arose. Miss Shaw's experience and tact has stood her in good stead, and it may be stated without qualification that the colony has been an unexampled success. There have inevitably been difficulties as to the housing of girls from such different localities and varied stations in life that their habits, manners, speech at first presented awkward barriers. But the girls have been met in a spirit of confidence to which they could not fail to respond. Any religious problems have been entirely overcome by the careful selection of resident workers who represent the various denominations. The canteen attached to the colony, where the girls from all the hostels take their meals, is a further triumph of far-sighted organization. Lady cooks have been put in charge and labor-saving appliances introduced. It is no uncommon occurrence in the canteen to serve 2,500 hungry workers with a hot meal within 7 minutes of the sounding of the factory buzzer for the cessation of work. In addition to this huge task, Miss Shaw has initiated many schemes for the recreation and education of her boarders. Classes in hospital work, fire drill, singing, dancing, and gymnastic exercises have been started and are now most popular. Occasional fancy dress balls are encouraged and games are taught. The result of these efforts is seen in the spirit of happiness pervading the colony and in the efficiency of the women workers in this group of factories, which surpasses the dreams of an optimist. Miss Shaw, however, could not be spared to watch the results of her labor in Coventry, for when she had established the colony in working order, her organizing capacity was requisitioned for a still larger task. She is now inspecting and advising on canteens and hostels for the Ministry of Munitions all over the United Kingdom. 26. Mrs. Harley. Mrs. Harley, sister of Field Marshal Viscount French, commenced her nursing service at the beginning of the war and was still carrying on fine work for the sick and suffering when she met her death in their cause on March 7, 1917. The shell which burst near Monastir has robbed the world of a noble and heroic lady. In 1914, Mrs. Harley went to France as administrator of the first unit sent out by the Scottish Women's Hospitals. She proceeded to establish a wonderful hospital in the historical Abbaye de Royaumont, one of the most beautiful haunts of the ancient peace in the world. Under the direction of Dr. Francis Ivans, this hospital today is one of the finest and most complete in France, an important feature being the possession of a perfect X-ray installation specially chosen by Madame Curie. The work of the first government unit was so successful that the French government soon asked for a second, and Mrs. Harley took over the administration and went to Troyes to start a hospital there in May 1915. This hospital was known as the Girton and Newnham Unit, the past and present students of those colleges having raised a large sum towards the equipment. The first hospital under the canvas to be used by the French, it received General Joffre's sanction as a French military hospital. When later in the year the French expeditionary force was sent to Salonika, the military authorities requested that this unit of Scottish women should go with the expedition, and Mrs. Harley again accompanied them as administrator. On arrival, they were dispatched to Jevgeli in Serbia, but had to retire in the Serbian retreat. They then established a hospital at Salonika, which is still open. In July 1916, Mrs. Harley came to England to take over a flying column of motor ambulances for service in the Salonika district. She returned to Serbia accompanied by Dr. Agnes Bennett, who was in charge of the American unit of the Scottish Women's Hospitals, equipped with funds subscribed by supporters in America as a result of Miss Kathleen Burke's appeal. Mrs. Harley's column consisted of a number of light ambulance lorries and 2 field kitchens. Its object was to facilitate the more speedy transport of wounded Serbians whose sufferings were greatly increased by the shortage of motor ambulances. The column was sent to work near the Macedonian front, quite close to the firing line. Riding home, Mrs. Harley said, "Now to tell you our first venture. A few days ago, a British officer, just down from the front, came to tell me that the wounded Serbs were in great need of nourishment when they were carried down from the field, and I asked if I could take up my motor kitchen and start a canteen for them. In a few hours, all was arranged, and the next morning I started off. We are fairly near the front and in hearing of the guns. It is sad seeing the poor men struggle in, and it is good to be able to give them some help. A little later, Dr. Bennett of the American unit wrote, "We are now engaged on very difficult work here, getting all the most serious cases direct from the dressing station. These we bring into hospital ourselves with the aid of Mrs. Harley's flying column. This is very difficult and often very dangerous work, owing to the bad roads and heavy hill climbing. Our women chauffeurs have done splendid service, and Mrs. Harley's have been equally helpful. We have had a hard day, and many of the wounded were still lying out on the hillside awaiting transport, which is very scarce. It must have been a strange enough sight in the midst of the lonely, barren mountain country and along the rough, precipitous roads to come upon a van of the Scottish Women's Hospitals driven by a sunburnt girl of the unit bringing her load of Serbian wounded collected with danger and difficulty down to the safety of the hospital. In January 1917, Mrs. Harley turned her energies to helping the population of Serbian civilian refugees at Monastir who were in dire need of food and medical assistance. She also established an orphanage at Monastir where she collected more than 80 children and looked after them at her own expense. It was when engaged on her errand of mercy that Mrs. Harley met her death. She was wounded in the head by a shell splinter during one of the periodical Bulgarian bombardments of Monastir, an open town, at the moment when she was actually distributing food to starving Serbians in front of her house. The touching scenes at Mrs. Harley's funeral are evidence of the esteem and gratitude with which she was regarded in Serbia. She was buried at Salonika with full military honors, and her coffin, covered with the Union Jack, was followed by a great concourse which included a large proportion of Serbians. In the funeral oration pronounced over her grave, the Serbian Minister of the Interior said, "Noble daughter of a great nation, though not a sister of ours by birth, still dear to us as a true sister, your tender soul is followed and ever will be followed by our fervent prayers and by the everlasting gratitude of the Serbian nation. Thanks and glory be to you." That her spirit and courage live on is manifest in the declaration by one of her two daughters, both engaged in hospital work in Serbia, that after her mother's funeral, it was her intention to return to Monastir to carry on Mrs. Harley's work. As a recognition of her services to the French, Mrs. Harley was decorated by General Sorel with the Croix de Guerre with palm leaves, one of the highest of French decorations. 28. Miss Ethel Rolfe and the Women Acetylene Welders. In the autumn of 1915, the organizers of the Women's Service Bureau, anxious to assist women who applied to them for help and advice in obtaining posts under the newly constituted Ministry of Munitions, immediately sought openings in which educated women with a natural bent towards machinery and mechanical work could receive instruction in a skilled process. After consideration, it was decided to arrange a training in the process of oxyacetylene welding, a work which seemed to combine various advantages. It was a skilled process comparatively new in England, and one which women had hitherto had no opportunity of learning, and should they be successful in taking up the work, there would be plenty of scope for them, as the process was being increasingly used in aeroplane manufacture. For this reason, there was a good chance of its being continued after the war, and not proving a blind alley like so much present-day work. Accordingly, a small school was established under an able and experienced metalworker, Miss F.C. Woodward. The process taught is almost entirely used in aeroplane construction, namely the welding of sockets and joints, struts, levers, and the parts of the framework. Even before the war, there had been a shortage of trained welders, and with the enormous increase in airplane work and the enlistment of so many skilled mechanics, the demand for such workers was enormously increased. The school was opened in September 1915, and by December, the first girls were sufficiently trained to take posts in a factory, the controller of which had been interested in the project and had helped the school at its start in setting up the necessary plant. The pioneer women welders have been followed by a steady stream, and such has been the success of the training that no welder has any difficulty in obtaining employment as soon as she leaves the school. From this small training center alone, over 150 welders have already passed into various works. The process is generally recognized as the speediest and most effective way of securing a perfect weld without any deleterious effect upon the metal, and consists in employing the flame produced by the combustion in a suitable blowpipe of oxygen and acetylene. The temperature of the flame at the apex is about 6,300 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is by this means that the metals to be welded together are brought to a suitable heat. The workers' eyes have to be protected from the powerful light by special goggles, and they also have to wear caps over their hair and leather aprons. The work is fascinating even to the onlooker and absorbing to anyone with craftsman's instincts. It involves considerable responsibility, and the welder needs to be conscientious and careful in the extreme, as upon the efficiency of her work, if used for aircraft construction, depends the stability of the machine and consequently the life of the airman. The women welders have not established their position without difficulty, faced as they were from the start with the fact that men engaged on precisely the same work with no greater output were yet receiving considerably higher wages. By first banding themselves together in a trade union, and by bringing the question up for arbitration as to whether their work was skilled or unskilled, the decision being given in their favor, the women welders have achieved equal recognition with men, and that without having recourse to strikes and dislocation of national work in wartime. A typical worker among the learners of this new craft for women is Miss Ethel Rolfe. One of the first women to enter the school, after a short course of training, she took a post in an aircraft factory where she was the only woman welder. She worked with one man welder, and sometimes when work was slack, owing to the supply of parts being hung up, she did brazing, which she learned from the men with whom she worked. She also did fitting rather than stand idle, and as much overtime was being worked, she could help on all three processes when occasion required. In December 1915, after a good deal of practical experience, Miss Rolfe accepted a post in a government department. In this capacity, she visited airplane works all over the country, spending from 3 to 10 days in the shops, studying the work done by women and that done by men which women might take over. She reported to her department on the detailed organization of women's work, on the methods of training, and the possibility of further dilution of men's work in each firm by the employment of more female labor. To do this, she had to inquire into technical processes, machines, and workshop arrangements. She specially urged the increased employment of women in fitting and sheet metal work, woodwork, and welding, and in some cases on the erection of airplanes and the installation of the engine. After continuing this work for some months, she was promoted and transferred to the production department. She now inspects aeroplane firms and reports to her department with a view to an ever-increasing output, chiefly obtainable by greater efficiency in the labor of women, improved arrangements in the shops, and in the methods of teaching and supervision. This unique opportunity of studying the types of machines and methods of construction, coupled with the help of resident inspecting engineers, has given her an amount of technical knowledge which, with her personal experience of factory conditions, has helped her in the work of selecting suitable operations for female labor. Before the war, Miss Rolfe had no previous mechanical or scientific training. She had always regretted the lack of opportunity which women found in the industrial world, and especially in engineering trades. Another pupil of the welding school, Miss Margaret Godsall, who became charge hand at an aircraft factory, has recently died from inflammatory rheumatism. She contracted this illness as a result of staying on at the factory during a rush of urgent work, though she was suffering from influenza. It is a pathetic example of the keenness and the self-sacrifice with which girls are throwing themselves into their tasks, and their service to the country will always be remembered as one of the finest records of the war. End of section 11. Section 12 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 28. Lady Lugard and the War Refugees Committee. In her work for the great population of Belgian refugees who came over to England in the first few months of the war, Lady Lugard has helped to carry out one of the highest missions to suffering humanity. Quick to grasp the significance of the German advance through Belgium, Lady Lugard, in the first week of the war, turned her thoughts to the plight of the unfortunate women and children driven from their ruined homes with nothing left to them save life itself. Where were they to go, and what was to become of them? Obviously, England offered the only safe refuge. Lady Lugard knew of the complete and detailed arrangements which had been worked out during the summer of 1914 for the reception of refugees from Ulster in the event of the anticipation of civil war being realized. Understanding the importance of rapid action and the value of a good organization, Lady Lugard asked the help of the Ulster leaders, who willingly placed their machinery at the disposal of workers in such a worthy cause. After enlisting the support of Cardinal Bourne and the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church, and having obtained the consent and advice of both the Foreign Office and of the Belgian authorities, Lady Lugard, with the help of Mrs. Alfred Littleton, formed a committee. But there was little time for deliberation or arrangement before she and her helpers were rushed into action. Warned on one day that a shipload of possibly 1,000 refugees might be with them on the next, they had immediately to arrange offices, raise funds, and prepare accommodation. Mr. Norrie Miller, the manager of the General Accident, Fire, and Life Assurance Corporation, placed offices at the committee's disposal free of charge and secured the nucleus of a clerical staff. The organization decided to be known as the War Refugees Committee. Its non-political and non-sectarian character was marked by the fact that Lord Hugh Cecil became chairman and Lord Gladstone treasurer, while the Roman Catholic and Jewish churches were represented among its members. Lady Lugard and Mrs. Littleton at once proceeded to issue an appeal through the newspapers. The response was overwhelming. All England was burning with admiration and pride at the great part which Belgium was playing. Throughout the country, from homes humble and great, rich and poor, money and offers of help flowed in on such a scale that even with the best endeavors, it took many days before they could be acknowledged and classified. Eagerness to help the victims, whose suffering was part of the price Belgium had to pay in her fight for honor, was England's tribute of admiration. The next question was the momentous one of temporary accommodation for the refugees on arrival. With the assistance of an ever-increasing group of willing volunteer workers, the War Refugees Committee soon arranged for beds and food to be prepared in the buildings placed at their disposal. These were hastily improvised as hostels with the help of generous loans of linen and crockery. If the accommodation at first was sketchy, there were at least beds and food for all who came, and eager sympathy and welcome. They needed all the help and comfort which could be given to them, these dazed and terrified people with the haunted look of horror on their faces. They had endured experiences which our civilization could have ascribed only to a bygone age, and which we little thought could pollute the earth again. During the next weeks, the stream of refugees flowed into London in ever greater numbers. The work of the War Refugees Committee soon classified itself automatically into departments. The clerical department had to cope with correspondence, which within a fortnight had mounted to many thousands of letters a day, containing money contributions and placing accommodation for 100,000 people at the disposal of the committee. Refugees had to be received on arrival and temporarily housed. The question then arose of their allocation to more permanent headquarters and of arranging that offers of hospitality from all over the country should be responded to by suitable allotment of refugees. From the first, it was found advisable to decentralize as much as possible and to allow the local committees formed throughout the country to make most of the detailed arrangements for allocation. These committees numbered before long between 2,000 and 3,000. Questions of transport and clothing were in the hands of other rapidly organized departments. Every day, the number of refugees increased, and members of the committees worked almost without rest day and night. In the first week of September, a government invitation was published offering refuge in England to the Belgian civilian population. The magnitude of the task thus became beyond the management of a group of private individuals, and the committee was relieved of a certain amount of anxiety by the provision of refuges on a big scale in London at government expense. Though the work was now extended and receiving government assistance, it was to the War Refugees Committee, which about this time was placed by mutual consent under the general direction of Lord Gladstone, that the authorities turned to carry on the great task. The committee has continued to work throughout in close cooperation with the government departments, particularly the local government board. Large buildings such as the Alexandra Palace and the Earl's Court exhibition buildings were taken over and prepared for the reception of the refugees, serving as clearinghouses whence they could be sent on to the provinces, where arrangements for hospitality were made both by local communities and by private individuals. The staff of voluntary helpers in London soon reached 500, who threw themselves with undaunted energy and devotion into the task which Lady Lugard herself had described as the consolation of a nation by a nation. In all her personal intercourse with the Belgian refugees, especially of the working class, Lady Lugard has said that what struck her most was their pathetic fortitude and the way in which, in their hour of desperate need, they clung to their religion. Chapels and oratories were rapidly established wherever Belgians were received, and the Roman Catholic Church and community worked unremittingly to comfort and console them. I don't know how many thousand rosaries I distributed in those days, said Lady Lugard afterwards. Wherever I went, the Belgians seemed to clamor for them above everything. It should also be mentioned that the Jewish community in London took a very active part in helping their co-religionists among the refugees. From September till Christmas 1914, the flow of refugees continued, the fall of Antwerp in October bringing a tremendous rush of work amid surging crowds. On one day in October, the number of refugees handled by the committee amounted to 6,621. By February 1915, their arrival in anything like large numbers had practically ceased, but other problems sprang up. It became obvious that the war was to last longer than the few months which optimists of the early days prophesied. It was therefore decided, after considerable hesitation, that it was better, both in their own interests and in those of the community at large, that the Belgians, who had lived almost entirely as guests, should be allowed to work and to become gradually self-supporting. In the 2 years which have elapsed, the working-class people who formed the bulk of the refugees, while giving still some occasion for preoccupation and expense to their own and to the British governments, have become practically absorbed. In the ever-increasing demand for labor, the Belgians, who are known to be among the best craftsmen and laborers in Europe, have found a ready market for their work. There has remained the comparatively small number of refugees of a different class, unaccustomed to earn their own living, but rendered destitute as the poorest artisans by the devastation of their country. The great initial work accomplished, Lady Lugard and the many others who had by this time become absorbed in the work of consolation turned to making suitable provision for this group, which included families of high social position, artists, and professionals in many spheres of work. Men and women suddenly snatched from circumstances of prosperity and ease and confronted with the problems of bare existence. To assist these unfortunate people, Lady Lugard organized a small hospitality committee. She and her helpers proceeded to arrange a system in London, and similar arrangements have been evolved on private initiative in the great centers in the provinces. In London, large houses were placed one by one at the committee's disposal, and social groups of Belgian families were established in them. In these hostels, family life is as far as possible reproduced. Questions of education, health, and clothing receive special care and attention, and the attempt has been made to classify the houses in such a way as to bring friends and potential friends into the same circles. The results have been most satisfactory. The domestic management is undertaken in each house by a competent manager, sometimes Belgian, sometimes English, appointed by Lady Lugard's committee. Many of the managers are lady volunteers who give the whole of their time to the promotion of happiness and comfort in what one of the guests has described as ces petits coins de Belgique. The one rule of the committee is to try and make the Belgians happy. If their lives are necessarily restricted and limited by circumstances, these Belgian guests are at any rate living in quiet resting places, recovering, it is hoped, from the shock of their experiences, educating their children, and meanwhile possessing their souls in patience till the day of their country's liberation. The numbers in which the Belgian population took refuge in England from first to last have been so great, and the rush in the beginning so bewildering, that it would have been impossible to carry out a work of necessity hastily improvised without mistakes and difficulties. Lady Lugard is the first to admit how far the schemes fell short of the perfection which she had hoped to achieve. But when the story of this flight of a nation is told, history will remember not the misunderstandings, the mistakes in detail, or the want of foresight, which seem inevitable in all human undertakings, but the way in which the English people open their arms in welcome to the Belgians, and their desire to comfort and to heal. To Lady Lugard personally must be ascribed full recognition for a truly great service. By her promptitude, her imagination, and her unsparing gifts of energy and devotion, she stands out amongst the throng of splendid volunteers in the service of Belgium. 29. Miss Christabel Ellis. Since the early days of the war, the aspect of our streets has undergone many changes, but there is no more certain sign of the times than the sight of women in khaki uniforms and military badges driving army motors and lorries. Though these enterprising women excited surprise some months ago, they are fast becoming as numerous as men drivers. The women drivers of the Army are under the management of a department of the Women's Legion and form a part of the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. At the head of the motor branch is Miss Christabel Ellis, who has in her hands the development of a great new scope of activity and usefulness for women workers. Miss Ellis, already an experienced motorist, offered her services to the French Red Cross in September 1914, and for some months she drove for them and also for the British Red Cross Society in France. During the days of the Battle of the Marne and the heavy fighting near Paris, the shortage of ambulances and drivers was so great that Miss Ellis sometimes drove for 20 hours at a stretch. At the end of 1914, she went to Serbia, where she managed the commissariat, storekeeping, and military returns for a group of 5 Red Cross hospitals for over a year, till the final torrent of invasion swept over that unhappy country. On Miss Ellis's return to England, she found that the demand for trained motor drivers and mechanics was fast outpacing the supply. Her own successful experience of motor work under the roughest conditions had taught her how well the services of women might be used to supplement men, especially in England, with the advantages of good roads and help in difficulties usually to be had close at hand. Miss Ellis discussed her ideas with Lady Londonderry, who had organized the Women's Legion for war service, and as a result of their representations, they were given permission to supply 20 women drivers as an experiment to take up work under the War Office in May 1916. The great value of women's employment in motor work lies in the fact that the men whom they are releasing are precisely the most valuable class of workers, namely trained mechanics, of whom there is an all too limited supply, which can only be augmented by the slow process of training others. Much of the work which the women drivers are undertaking is work upon which highly skilled men were wasted. Driving cars, for instance, for staff officers involves many empty hours simply spent in waiting. The women's reception by the men whose work they are taking over has been generous in the extreme. No trouble has been spared to help the girls in every possible way and to assist them to maintain the high standard of Army efficiency. The girl drivers work long hours, for they have to be on duty by 8 a.m. and often do not put their cars away till late at night, but they stand the strain of the life wonderfully well, and in spite of the bitter cold of last winter, there were few who dropped from the ranks. It cannot, of course, be maintained that the women's mechanical knowledge equals that of some of the men they are replacing, but the standard of care of their engines and cars increases with their experience, and their capacity and skill in driving are undoubted. Besides motor driving, there are other branches of women's work under the same department. There are corps of women dispatch riders, motor bicyclists, whose services are proving most valuable. Women are also taking over the charge of Army mechanical stores. This is responsible work which requires great accuracy, for if incorrect supplies are handed out, endless delay may be caused to the convoys. In the delicate and intricate work of assembling aeroplane engines, women also working under this department are proving more and more efficient. The numbers of women employed in this dilution of men's labor will soon reach many thousands, and the way in which they have succeeded in overcoming considerable prejudice against their employment in the Army is in itself testimony to their efficiency. To Miss Ellis belongs the recognition due to a woman who has been able to give personal proof of women's capacity in a comparatively new field. End of section 12. Section 13 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 30. Madame Bruneau and Miss Marion Mole. The experiences of Madame Bruneau and her sister, Miss Mole, who lived at Cambrai for over 2 years under German rule, provide an example of patient and unselfish work carried on in the most trying circumstances with splendid courage and devotion. Madame Bruneau is of English birth, married to a Frenchman resident in Cambrai. On the outbreak of war, she telegraphed to her sister, Miss Mole, to come and help her in an ambulance station which she was establishing in her house, affiliated to the Union des Femmes de France. Miss Mole left for Cambrai at once, arriving on August 13, 1914. There followed a few days of suspense, during which the French and English armies were retreating day by day nearer to Paris. And then, on August 26, the German army poured through Cambrai. A battle raged in the streets in front of Madame Bruneau's house and in the trenches behind her garden. Beds for 22 had been prepared, but in a very short time, 50 wounded were picked up and laid on mattresses provided by people of the quarter. While Miss Mole was tending the wounded, whom the French and German soldiers dragged inside their gates, Madame Bruneau went out under fire with her manservant to rescue a French soldier who had been overlooked. The first dressings were done at once, but not until late at night was even a German doctor available. The next day, the worst cases were sent to the civil hospital for operation, and then returned to the ambulance station to be cared for. During the following days and nights, work was incessant, but after a fortnight, all the wounded were transported as prisoners to Germany, and the ambulance station was practically closed. Miss Mole then went to one of the big hospitals in the town and was allowed to work for a time in the English wards, where she described the men as being in an incredible state of neglect. She was afterwards asked to take over the case of an Irish officer said to be dying of tetanus. By courageously begging some serum from the German authorities in spite of a hostile reception, and then by her devoted nursing, she won the officer back to life and was able to set him on the road to health before he was transported to Germany for internment. Madame Bruneau, meanwhile, had been doing all she could for the English wounded in the hospitals, visiting them constantly with gifts of fruit, eggs, milk, and puddings, and all the time doing her utmost to be allowed to reopen her ambulance station. In October 1914, the German permission was obtained. Madame Bruneau and Miss Mole were therefore able to continue their nursing till the Germans again closed the ambulance station in March 1915. During these months, the work was terribly hard, for the staff was short-handed and the patients were practically helpless, being mostly cases of paralysis or men with amputated limbs. Miss Mole narrowly escaped losing her arm from blood poisoning contracted while dressing a very septic case. It was only after several operations and 6 months of painful and anxious treatment that Miss Mole recovered the use of her arm. After the closing of the ambulance station for the second time, the sisters did all they could for the English and French prisoners in Cambrai, arranging to send them food, gifts, and messages by every means they could devise. Early in 1916, they took up this work for the prisoners in a more organized way, working under the mairie of the town and using their house as a depot for garments and food. Being very short of money, wrote Miss Mole, I also gave lessons in English, by which means I was able to buy bread. This meant self-denial on the part of the people who sold it to me, as we were all on bread rations. Food was very scarce, and without the American ravitaillement, we should certainly have starved. As time went on, life grew increasingly difficult, and the German regime became daily more severe. Many of their friends were arrested, some evacuated from their houses, and others sent as hostages to Germany. In November 1916, Madame Bruno and Miss Mull were turned out of their house and were thankful to take refuge in a tiny dwelling half shattered by aeroplane bombs. At last, all hope of further service being gone, they applied to join a train of refugees and were allowed to leave Cambrai in December 1916. No women could have worked harder than these sisters during more than 2 years for the wounded, the prisoners, the desolate and poor of the forlorn city, cooking, sewing, giving without thought for themselves, uttering no complaints, forgetting their own need in the bitter need around them. A terrible journey home, preceded by the inevitable internment in Germany, might have seemed the finishing stroke. But undaunted by all they have seen and suffered, the sisters have gathered their courage to build up life afresh and to restore something of all that was so suddenly crushed for them and for thousands more in the worldwide disaster of the war. 31. Some Army Nurses. The noble host of Army nurses contains few names which are known to the general public. But for those who scan the Gazette with care, there stand out women whose deeds swell the ever-lengthening list of heroines, not only by shining acts of gallantry, but by month after month of patient, devoted work. The wonderful Army Medical Organization has covered a vast field, and the endeavor has been throughout the war that in any place, in any region, where sick and wounded soldiers are likely to be congregated, there should always be a supply of nurses to minister to them. Soldiers removed from the battlefield are handed over from the ambulances directly to nurses, and are never from that time onwards, whether in trains, ships, or hospitals, at home, in France, or in the remotest of the battle zones, away from the care of trained nurses. The short accounts of work which follow have been received from typical nurses who, following the traditions of their service, specially ask to remain anonymous. The first type of hospital nearest to the battlefield where nurses are allowed to work is the casualty clearing station. An idea of the work can be gained from a sentence in a nurse's letter home. Fights in the air are very common, but we are so busy we rarely have time to look. The casualty clearing stations have frequently been under bombardment, and bomb dropping from aeroplanes is so usual an occurrence as to be hardly worth mentioning. Among the many reports of nurses under shell fire is that of a staff nurse who, although knocked down by the explosion of a shell, resumed her work until all the patients were evacuated. Another nursing sister was present in the operating theater when it was wrecked by an explosion of a 15-inch shell, which wounded her. In spite of her wound, she remained at work for 5 hours and displayed great courage in continuing to attend to patients. The following is a description by a nurse of the casualty clearing station work. We were usually very full of patients. At one time, convoys every other day, besides a constant stream in small numbers. 88 patients passed through the ward I was in one day, leaving us 50 at night. If the 50 beds were full, the stretchers were placed on trestles until sometimes it was most difficult to move. We had a very good system with the new cases. Perhaps 50 would come in at once. They were got into bed, undressed, washed, and fed. The medical officer went round and looked at all the wounds. If he decided they were to be evacuated, red labels were placed on the bed rail if they were to go by train lying, blue labels if they were to go sitting, and white labels if they must go by barge. Those for immediate operation had one with theater written on, pinned to the outer blanket, so that we could tell at a glance what to do for each. Another nurse writes, "When I think of these boys being carried in, wounded almost beyond all recognition, but smiling bravely to the last, it makes one feel proud to be British. As our Padre said, we did God's work up there." The nurses on the hospital trains have a fine record of service. Though less monotonous than the life in a stationary hospital, it is a curious existence to be living permanently in a train, continually traveling to and fro on one stretch of line, nursing in cramped quarters and under particularly tiring conditions. 3 nurses recently received the Military Medal for conspicuous bravery under fire on number 27 ambulance train. The train was carrying a full load of nearly 500 sick and wounded away by night from a town in the vicinity of the Somme front when an aeroplane attack began. 5 bombs fell in the immediate neighborhood of the train. The windows were smashed and the lights went out. The train gave a heave which threw some of the patients out of their cots. One of the sisters is reported to have called out to the men in her coach, "Now be quiet and good, boys, till I light a lamp." This she managed to do, and the men declared that her hand never trembled. The commanding officer reports that the sisters went about their work coolly, collectively, and cheerfully, and that by their magnificent conduct they not only allayed alarm among the helpless patients and those suffering from shell shock, but caused both patients and personnel to play up to the standard which they set. Wonderful work, too, has been done by the nurses in the hospital ships in conditions of ever-increasing danger. "We landed 1,300 wounded yesterday morning," writes a hospital ship sister on the cross-channel service. "It was a wonderful experience. Nearly 900 were on the decks and steerage with broken arms, etc. All the 84 in my ward were stretcher cases. The work was terrific." There is now an all too long list of nurses who have suffered shipwreck at the hands of the enemy, while some have lost their lives. When a great ship was recently torpedoed in the Mediterranean, the nurses had a narrow escape. One of them has described her experience in the open boat as follows. "Our safety lay in keeping as far from the ship as possible, heavy seas making the pull to land out of the question. The huge swell increased the fear for our safety of our boat, as we were sitting waist deep in water. Bailing was of no use. The harder we bailed, the quicker we filled. A cry from the back of the boat caused all eyes to turn in time to see the ship first list to port side, then turn and take a long straight dip beneath the waves. The sea was wilder and rougher than ever, and 3 gigantic waves in succession completely swamped our small boat, and all that was left to us now was to cling to the ropes in the boat and to each other. Eventually, however, the nurses were rescued just in time by a destroyer. Such experiences are no longer rare adventures. They are the hourly anticipation of all workers who serve in hospital ships, since the Germans have ceased to regard the badge of the Red Cross as a sacred and inviolable symbol. A description is given elsewhere in this book of work in a typical base hospital. If comparisons are possible, perhaps the most unselfish of all hospital work is that which falls to the lot of those sisters and nurses whose duty is the care of the sick and wounded German prisoners. To have to expend their energy and devotion on Germans is unwelcome work for any Englishwoman today, but the spirit in which these nurses accept their difficult task is well illustrated by the following account from a sister who is in charge of a ward of German prisoners in a great military hospital in London. She says, "The German prisoner of war in hospital in England comes on the whole as a pleasant surprise, though a nurse gets an unpleasant shock when she is detailed for duty amongst the prisoners. For several months I have been in charge of a large number of wounded Germans, and I find them on the whole quite good patients. At first their cleanliness and habits are not all that can be desired, neither do they bear pain well. But they give very little trouble and are extremely grateful for what is done for them. They are very observant and make themselves quite useful as soon as they are able to get about. They are of great assistance to the nurses in carrying round screens, wheeling dressing trolleys, etc. Perhaps the most striking thing about them is the almost womanly care which, without exception, they give to a comrade more sick than themselves. As patients, much may be said in their favor, and the work amongst them is a wonderful experience. No better proof could be given of how the true nurse's instinct dominates her entire work, her care for her patients, and above all, her appreciation of their good qualities, overcoming her natural and instinctive prejudice. To the nurses of the war, it will be admitted by all, belongs the crown of women's war service. Their ranks contain many heroines whose names and deeds will never be chronicled, but their selfless devotion, their courage, their unquestioning acceptance of any risk, and their willing sacrifice of personal comfort, health, and even life itself will stand for all time in the proudest memorials of these tragic years. End of section 13. End of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren.